Most people who lose everything in a divorce spend years trying to rebuild. But what Donald didn't realize when he took her last dollar was that he just handed her the key to an $800 million empire. Tell us where you are watching from in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe, like and share, because there is more ahead. The words would have sounded impossible to Victoria 6 months earlier. At that moment, however, she was standing outside the courthouse with a single suitcase in her hand, watching the man she had once loved drive away with everything they had built together. The black SUV disappeared through the iron gates. Donald never looked back. Victoria stood completely still. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the suitcase. Inside it were a few dresses, some shoes, personal documents, and a photograph she had almost thrown away that morning. That was all she had left. Not the mansion. Not the accounts. Not the investment portfolio. Not even the small apartment Donald had promised she could keep. Nothing. Donald had fought for every dollar during the divorce. And he had won. At least that was what he believed. For 7 years, Victoria had been married to a man who measured everything in numbers. Money. Property. Status. Connections. Even love seemed to have a price in Donald's world. When they first met, he had been charming. He had made Victoria feel as though she were the only woman in the world. But success changed him. Or perhaps success simply revealed who he had always been. He began reminding her that the house was his. The businesses were his. The investments were his. Whenever Victoria questioned him, he would smile and tell her she had nothing to worry about because she was his wife. But during the divorce, those words disappeared. His lawyers turned every sacrifice Victoria had made into evidence that she had contributed nothing. The years she had spent helping him organize his business became irrelevant. The clients she had introduced him to were forgotten. The business strategies she had quietly developed were suddenly described as Donald's ideas. And when the judge finally approved the settlement, Donald walked away with almost everything. Victoria had signed the final papers with trembling hands. Donald had leaned toward her afterward. "You should have thought about this before leaving," he whispered. Victoria looked at him. "I did." He smiled. "No, you didn't." She didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Donald believed the woman sitting across from him was defeated. He couldn't see that she had stopped trying to convince him of her worth months ago. Outside the courthouse, Victoria took a slow breath. Then she opened her phone. There was one unread message. The sender was a number she didn't recognize. She almost deleted it. Instead, she opened it. "I believe you are the person we've been looking for. Please call me when you're alone. This concerns the Hawthorne Foundation." Victoria froze. The Hawthorne Foundation. She hadn't heard that name in 15 years. Her eyes moved back to the message. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she deleted it. Or at least she thought she did. That night, Victoria checked into a modest hotel on the other side of the city. She placed her suitcase on the bed. The room was small. There was no marble bathroom, no enormous balcony, no expensive furniture. For the first time in years, nobody was waiting for her to prepare dinner. Nobody was asking where she had been. Nobody was reminding her how much his lifestyle cost. It should have felt terrifying. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. Victoria sat beside the window and looked at the city lights. Then she opened the photograph from her suitcase. It showed a much younger Victoria standing beside an elegant older woman. The woman was smiling. Victoria wasn't. She looked nervous. On the back of the photograph were 3 handwritten words. "Never forget who you are." Her mother's handwriting. Victoria closed her eyes. Her mother had died when she was 23. Her father had disappeared from her life years before that. After her mother's death, Victoria had deliberately buried everything connected to the Hawthorne family. She had wanted an ordinary life. Then she met Donald. And slowly, she had convinced herself that ordinary was enough. Her phone suddenly rang. The same unknown number. Victoria stared at the screen. She answered. "Hello." A man's voice came through. "Mrs. Hayes." "Yes. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney representing the Hawthorne family." Victoria's expression changed. "I think you've got the wrong person." "No," Daniel said calmly. "We don't." Silence. Then he continued. "Your mother left instructions 15 years ago. We were required to contact you only when certain conditions were met." Victoria frowned. "What conditions?" There was a pause. "Your divorce." Victoria's heart began beating faster. "What does my divorce have to do with my mother?" "Everything." Victoria stood. Daniel's next words made her grip the phone tighter. "Your mother didn't leave you money." Victoria exhaled. "Then why are you calling me?" Because she left you something much more valuable. Before Victoria could respond, Daniel said something that changed the direction of her life forever. Mrs. Hayes, you are not the beneficiary of the Hawthorne Foundation. Victoria's eyebrows drew together. Then who is? You are its controlling shareholder. The room seemed to become completely silent. Victoria couldn't speak. Daniel continued. The foundation controls a substantial interest in Hawthorne Global. Victoria sat down slowly. Hawthorne Global? Yes. She knew that name. Everyone did. Hawthorne Global was a multinational company with interests in technology, luxury properties, logistics, and private investments. It was one of the most valuable privately controlled business groups in the country. Victoria swallowed. How much is it worth? Daniel hesitated. Approximately $800 million. Victoria stared at the wall. 800 million. Her hands began trembling. But then another thought entered her mind. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because your mother specifically instructed us not to. Why? That is what you need to come to our office to learn. Victoria looked down at the photograph in her hand. Her mother's words suddenly felt different. Never forget who you are. The following morning, Victoria arrived at Daniel's office. She expected a small law firm. Instead, she walked into a building bearing the Hawthorne name. Daniel was waiting for her. On his desk was a thick leather folder. He opened it carefully. Inside were documents Victoria had never seen. Share certificates, corporate agreements, old photographs, letters, and finally, a sealed envelope bearing her mother's name. Victoria reached for it. Daniel stopped her. There's one more thing. She looked up. The controlling interest doesn't automatically transfer to you. Victoria's face fell. What does that mean? It means your mother created conditions. What conditions? Daniel pushed another document toward her. Victoria read the first paragraph. Then the second. Her breathing became shallow. The final condition was simple. To activate her controlling interest, Victoria had to personally take over a company her mother had established years earlier. A company Donald had unknowingly tried to acquire during their marriage. Victoria looked up sharply. Donald? Daniel nodded. He made an offer for it 2 years ago. Victoria's stomach tightened. How do you know? Daniel opened another folder. Inside was a copy of Donald's acquisition proposal. Victoria recognized his signature. She looked at Daniel. What happened? Daniel leaned back. Your husband wasn't buying an ordinary company. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What was he buying? Daniel's answer left her speechless. He was trying to buy the very company that gives you control of the Hawthorne empire. Victoria stared at the documents. Donald had spent years trying to acquire something he never knew already belonged to the woman he was divorcing. And suddenly she understood. Donald hadn't taken everything from her. He had taken the life she had outgrown. But there was still one question. Why had her mother waited until the divorce to unlock it? Daniel slowly slid the final document across the desk. There's something else your mother wanted you to know. Victoria looked down. Her mother's signature appeared at the bottom. And beneath it was a single sentence. Victoria read it once. Then again. Her face went pale. Because the sentence wasn't about money. It was about Donald. And it revealed that her mother had known exactly what kind of man he was long before Victoria ever married him. But why had she allowed Victoria to marry him anyway? As the story continues, tell us where you are watching from in the comments section and don't forget to subscribe, like and share because there is more ahead. Victoria stared at the sentence beneath her mother's signature. For several seconds she couldn't make sense of it. Then she read it again. If Donald Hayes ever becomes your husband, do not tell him about Hawthorne Global. Victoria's lips parted. How could she have known? Daniel didn't answer immediately. She knew more about Donald than you think. Victoria looked up sharply. My mother never met him. Not personally. Then how? Daniel folded his hands. Your mother investigated him. Victoria's heart sank. Why? Because before she died, she became concerned about the people surrounding the Hawthorne Foundation. Donald was one of them. Victoria shook her head. That doesn't make sense. Donald didn't even know my family had anything to do with Hawthorne Global. Are you sure? The question stopped her. Victoria remembered something. Years earlier, Donald had casually asked about her mother's maiden name. At the time, she hadn't thought anything of it. He had also asked whether her mother had left behind business records. She had laughed and told him there was nothing worth finding. Donald had smiled. Now those memories felt completely different. Daniel opened another file. Your mother believed Donald had been trying to get close to Hawthorne's assets for years. Victoria's expression hardened. So he didn't marry me because he loved me? I can't answer that. But you can show me the evidence. Daniel turned another page. There were financial records, emails, old business proposals. Donald had made several attempts to establish relationships with companies connected to Hawthorne Global. Every attempt had failed. Then, 7 years earlier, he had met Victoria. 3 months later, they were engaged. Victoria slowly sat back. She felt sick. For years, she had believed she had been the woman Donald chose because he loved her. Now she wasn't sure. What am I supposed to do with this? Daniel looked at her carefully. Your mother wanted you to make your own decision. What decision? Whether you want to take control. Victoria looked toward the window. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. People were going to work. Cars were moving through traffic. Millions of lives continued normally. But hers had just been turned upside down. I don't know anything about running an $800 million company. Daniel smiled faintly. Your mother thought you did. She was wrong. No. Daniel opened another folder. Inside were documents containing handwritten notes. Victoria recognized the handwriting immediately. Her mother's. Victoria understands people better than numbers. Another page. She listens before she speaks. Another. She sees problems before executives notice them. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Her mother had been watching her, believing in her, even when Victoria herself had forgotten how to believe in herself. Daniel leaned forward. Your mother didn't leave you the empire because she thought you were ready. Then why? Because she knew you would become ready. For the first time since the divorce, Victoria smiled. It was small, but it was real. Over the following weeks, Victoria began learning everything. She studied the company's history. She met senior executives. She reviewed financial reports. She discovered that Hawthorne Global was not simply valuable. It was influential. But she also discovered something else. The company was struggling with an internal problem. A major expansion had stalled. Several executives wanted to sell part of the business. Others wanted to bring in outside investors. Victoria disagreed. She proposed a completely different strategy. Instead of selling the struggling division, she recommended restructuring it around a technology platform the company had nearly abandoned. One executive laughed. You've been here 6 weeks. Victoria calmly looked at him. And you've been here 6 years. The room went silent. She continued. You've studied the numbers. I studied why customers stopped trusting us. That meeting changed everything. Within months, the division began recovering. Victoria wasn't simply learning the business. She was changing it. And somewhere along the way, someone began watching her. His name was Alexander Reed. He was 39, private, highly respected, and almost impossible to impress. He had built his own investment firm before becoming one of Hawthorne Global's largest strategic partners. When they first met, Alexander didn't know Victoria's entire history. He only knew she was unusually perceptive. They began talking after a late board meeting. You don't seem comfortable with wealthy people, Alexander observed. Victoria smiled. I spent 7 years married to one. And? I learned that money and character are completely different things. Alexander laughed softly. That may be the smartest thing I've heard all week. Their relationship developed slowly. There were no extravagant gifts, no instant declarations, no dramatic promises, just conversations, coffee after meetings, long discussions about business, occasional dinners where they talked about everything except money. Alexander respected Victoria's independence. When she rejected his help, he didn't become offended. When she disagreed with him, he listened. And when she told him she was afraid she was only succeeding because people felt sorry for her, he looked directly at her. Victoria, nobody puts an incompetent woman in charge of an $800 million empire. She smiled. That's not exactly comforting. It wasn't supposed to be. For the first time in years, Victoria felt seen. Not as Donald's wife. Not as the woman who had lost everything. Just Victoria. Meanwhile, Donald's life was beginning to unravel. At first he enjoyed his victory. He moved into the larger house. He bought a new car. He told his friends that Victoria had been completely dependent on him. But then his business began struggling. A major investor withdrew. One of his acquisitions failed. And an opportunity he had been pursuing for years suddenly disappeared. Hawthorne Global had rejected his proposal. Again. Donald was furious. What do you mean they won't sell? His assistant looked uncomfortable. They've changed their strategy. Who changed it? I don't know. Donald slammed his hand onto the desk. Find out. The assistant hesitated. There are rumors that someone new is making strategic decisions. Who? We don't know. Donald leaned back. For the first time, something about the situation bothered him. He had spent years trying to get inside Hawthorne Global. Now someone had appeared out of nowhere and was blocking every move he made. He ordered his assistant to investigate. 2 days later, a thin folder landed on his desk. Donald opened it. The first page contained several recent corporate decisions. The second contained financial projections. The third showed a photograph. Donald stared at it. Victoria, his former wife, standing beside several Hawthorne executives. His face went blank. No. He flipped the page. There was another photograph. Victoria entering the Hawthorne headquarters. Another. Victoria speaking at a private investment meeting. Donald stood abruptly. What the hell is this? His assistant swallowed. We believe she's working with Hawthorne Global. Donald laughed. It wasn't genuine laughter. It was disbelief. Victoria? Yes. She doesn't know anything about that company. The assistant hesitated. She appears to be involved at a senior level. Donald looked again at the photograph. Something wasn't right. Victoria had changed. Not physically. Something deeper. She stood differently. She looked confident. She looked like someone who finally knew exactly where she belonged. Donald felt a strange pressure in his chest. Then his assistant placed one final document on the desk. We found something else. Donald looked down. It was an old corporate record. The name at the top was Victoria's. Donald frowned. That can't be right. It was verified. He continued reading. His expression slowly changed. Because beneath Victoria's name was a title that made no sense. Controlling shareholder, Hawthorne Global. Donald stared at the page. Then he remembered the divorce. The settlement. The assets he had taken. The money. The properties. The investments. He had believed he had stripped Victoria of everything. But suddenly he understood something terrifying. The assets he had fought over were worth millions. The thing he had never known about was worth hundreds of millions. Donald dropped the document onto his desk. Who is she working with? His assistant shook his head. We're still trying to determine that. Find out. We have another problem. Donald looked up. What? The assistant hesitated. There is a man frequently seen with her. Donald felt an unexpected wave of anger. Who? We don't know yet. Then find his name. That same evening, Victoria stood on the balcony of her apartment with Alexander beside her. The city lights stretched into the distance. I never thought my life would look like this, she whispered. Alexander looked at her. Do you regret leaving? Victoria thought about Donald. The courthouse. The suitcase. The humiliation. Then she shook her head. No. Alexander smiled. Good. Victoria turned toward him. Why? Because if you regretted it, I'd have to convince you to stay. She laughed. Then Alexander's expression became serious. There is something you should know. Victoria's smile disappeared. What? Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He showed her a photograph. Donald. Victoria's eyes narrowed. How did you get this? He's been investigating you. Her heart sank. Why? Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Because Donald has finally discovered that you own Hawthorne. Victoria stared at him. Then Alexander added quietly. He's also discovered something else. What? Alexander turned the phone toward her again. This time the photograph showed Alexander himself. Underneath it was a headline from a financial publication. Victoria read the name. Her eyes widened. She looked at Alexander. You're not just an investor. He said nothing. You never told me. I wanted you to know me before you knew my net worth. Victoria's heartbeat quickened. What is your net worth? Alexander held her gaze. But before he could answer, Victoria's phone began ringing. It was Daniel. She answered. His voice sounded urgent. Victoria, don't go to the Hawthorne Gala tomorrow night. Why? There has been a development. What kind? Daniel paused. Then he said something that made Victoria's blood run cold. Donald has been invited. Victoria looked at Alexander. And suddenly, she realized tomorrow night would be the first time she would face the man who thought he had taken everything from her. But Donald still didn't know the most important truth. He hadn't yet discovered who Alexander Reed really was. The Hawthorne Gala was supposed to celebrate the company's strongest year in nearly a decade. Instead, for Victoria, it felt like a reckoning. The ballroom was filled with some of the most influential business leaders in the country. Crystal chandeliers hung above hundreds of guests. Executives spoke quietly over champagne. Investors, politicians, entrepreneurs, and celebrities moved through the room as photographers captured the evening. Victoria stood near the entrance in an elegant black gown. She wasn't nervous. At least that was what she kept telling herself. Beside her stood Alexander. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but there was something about his presence that made people instinctively move aside when he walked past. Victoria had noticed it before. Tonight she finally understood why. "You still haven't told me," she whispered. Alexander glanced at her. "Told you what? Who you really are." A faint smile appeared on his face. "You already know who I am." "No. I know who you let me believe you were." Alexander looked toward the ballroom. Then he turned back to her. "My family owns Reed Capital." Victoria's expression changed. She knew the name. Everyone in the financial world knew it. Reed Capital was one of the largest private investment groups in the country. "But that's not all," she whispered. Alexander shook his head. "No." Before he could continue, the lights dimmed. The host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate the future of Hawthorne Global." The room applauded. Victoria looked toward the stage. A large screen behind the speaker displayed the Hawthorne logo. Then something unexpected happened. The presentation changed. A photograph appeared. Victoria. The room erupted in applause. Her name appeared beneath the photograph. Victoria Hayes, controlling shareholder. Victoria felt her throat tighten. Months ago, that name had represented a woman who had lost everything. Tonight, it represented something entirely different. The host continued. "Over the past year, Hawthorne Global has undergone one of the most remarkable strategic transformations in its history." The audience applauded again. Victoria looked around. Then she saw him. Donald. He stood near the rear of the ballroom. For a moment, neither of them moved. He looked exactly as she remembered him. Expensive suit. Perfect hair. Confident posture. But there was something missing. The arrogance in his eyes had become uncertainty. Victoria's heart did not race. She had expected it to. Instead, she felt strangely calm. Donald slowly walked toward her. "Victoria." She nodded. "Donald." His eyes moved over her. "You look different." "I am." He swallowed. "I heard you were involved with Hawthorne." "I am." Donald forced a smile. "You should have told me." Victoria almost laughed. "Why?" "Because I could have helped." She looked at him quietly. "You couldn't even let me keep my apartment." His smile disappeared. "That was business." "No," Victoria said softly. "It was personal." Donald looked away. Then his eyes moved toward Alexander. "Who's he?" Alexander extended his hand. "Alexander Reed." Donald froze. The name meant something. He searched his memory. Then he remembered the business reports. Reed Capital. The private investment group. The mysterious billionaire investor who rarely appeared publicly. Donald slowly lowered his hand. "You're Alexander Reed?" Alexander nodded. Donald stared at him. "But you're?" "Yes." Victoria watched the realization spread across Donald's face. Alexander wasn't simply a wealthy investor. He was the man behind one of the most powerful private investment groups in the country. And suddenly, Donald understood why every business opportunity he had pursued seemed to disappear. Alexander had been involved in several of the deals Donald had failed to secure. Donald looked at Victoria. "You married him?" Victoria's expression remained calm. "We're together." Donald laughed nervously. "This doesn't make sense." Victoria said nothing. He looked at Alexander. "Did you know who she was when you met her?" "Yes." Donald looked back at Victoria. "And you still chose her?" Alexander's voice was calm. "I didn't choose her because of Hawthorne." Donald frowned. "Then why?" Alexander looked at Victoria. "Because she was Victoria." For the first time that evening, Donald had no response. Then one of the giant screens behind them changed. The organizers were displaying profiles of the evening's most influential business leaders. A Forbes feature appeared. The headline read, "Alexander Reed, the private powerhouse behind a new generation of global investment." Donald stared at the screen. The article described Alexander as one of the youngest major private investors in the country and estimated the Reed family's combined holdings at several $billion. Donald slowly turned toward Victoria. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. The realization was already complete. The woman he had once forced to leave their marriage with a suitcase now stood beside the man he had spent years trying to reach professionally. But then Donald noticed something else. The Forbes feature wasn't just about Alexander. A second article appeared. Hawthorne Global's $800 million turnaround. And beneath the headline was Victoria's photograph. Donald stared at it. His lips parted. "You're the one." Victoria looked at him. "The one what?" "The person who turned Hawthorne around." She nodded. Donald took a step backward. "You actually did it." Victoria looked at him for several seconds. "Yes." The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than any insult could have. Donald remembered the day she left the courthouse. The suitcase, the fear in her eyes, the way he had told himself she would never recover. He remembered saying, "You'll realize you need me." Now he realized something. She had never needed him. She had only needed the courage to stop living beneath his shadow. Donald lowered his voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria's expression softened. "Because you never asked who I was." He stared at her. "You lied to me." "No," she said. "I simply stopped explaining myself to someone who had already decided what I was worth." Donald looked away. The ballroom continued around them. People laughed. Music played. Waiters moved between tables. But for Donald, everything felt distant. Then he asked the question that had been haunting him since he saw her. "What did my divorce settlement actually mean?" Victoria looked at him. "It meant you got everything you fought for." His eyes narrowed. "And you got Hawthorne?" "No." She shook her head. "I didn't get Hawthorne because of the divorce." Donald frowned. "Then what happened?" Victoria looked toward Alexander. Then back at Donald. "My mother created a condition." "What condition?" "She knew that one day I might lose everything because I would choose a man over myself." Donald went silent. "She wanted me to have nothing left to hide behind." Victoria took a breath. "So she arranged for the controlling interest to become active only after I had walked away from the marriage." Donald stared at her. "That means?" "Yes." Victoria's voice remained calm. "Your divorce didn't give me the empire." She paused. "It gave me the freedom to accept it." Donald looked as though someone had struck him. All those months he had celebrated. All the money he had taken. Every asset he had fought over. Every victory he had bragged about. He suddenly understood how meaningless they were compared with what he had never even known existed. "You knew?" he asked Alexander. "Yes." "For how long?" "Before I met her." Donald looked at Victoria. "And you married him?" Victoria smiled faintly. "No." Donald frowned. "What?" Alexander took Victoria's hand. "We haven't married yet." Donald looked between them. For the first time that night, confusion replaced his anger. Alexander looked at Victoria. "I wanted to wait until you knew that you were choosing me for the right reason." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "And what reason is that?" "Because you love me." Victoria smiled. "I do." Donald looked away. There was nothing left for him to say. He had entered the gala believing he might still have influence over Victoria. Instead, he discovered that the woman he had tried to reduce to nothing had become more powerful than he could have imagined. But Victoria's story wasn't about becoming richer than Donald. It wasn't about humiliating him. And it certainly wasn't about finding a wealthy man to replace him. Her real victory had happened months earlier. The day she walked out of the courthouse carrying one suitcase. The day she stopped measuring herself by what Donald had left her. The day she realized that losing a marriage did not mean losing herself. Months later, Victoria stood in the Hawthorne headquarters looking through the glass walls of her office. Below her, thousands of employees were beginning another day. Alexander walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled. "Still no champagne?" "Coffee first." She laughed. Then she looked at the city. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Donald hadn't taken everything?" Alexander thought about it. "Yes." Victoria turned toward him. "What do you think?" "I think you might still be wondering who you were." She smiled. That was the truth. Donald had believed he had taken her money, her house, her security, her future. But he had accidentally taken away the chains that had kept her from discovering herself. Victoria had not become powerful because Donald lost. She became powerful because she finally stopped believing she was powerless. And somewhere far away, Donald was living with the consequences of the decision he once considered his greatest victory. He had won the divorce. But Victoria had won her life. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't watching the person who hurt you suffer. Sometimes, it's becoming so whole that their opinion of you no longer matters. Because Donald had taken her last dollar. He thought he had taken everything. He never realized that he had simply opened the door. And behind that door was a future worth $800 million, and a woman he would never again be able to control. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to help us grow. The end.